And from the national headquarters of RT America, our nation's capital, hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. Today, at exactly 8:42 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the world became a more dangerous place. At exactly that moment, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that he is withdrawing the U.S. from its promise to not build more nuclear missiles. It was a promise that was made by Ronald Reagan in what many call the signature event of his foreign policy as president when he met with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. That is when the two historic leaders came together to sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, henceforth known as the INF Treaty. The U.S. says they are abandoning that deal because they don't trust the Russians, and they believe the Russians are cheating. The Russians, for their part, say they are not cheating and have invited the U.S. inspectors to the Russian Federation so they can see for themselves. This is a very important day. We have live team coverage of this seminal moment with reaction from both countries right here on the News with Rick Sanchez, where we do believe it is time to do news again. And as we get started, as we often do, we give you the questions that we think you'll be talking about tomorrow. Is the nuclear arms race back on between these two superpowers? Why do billionaires scoff, in Davos in particular, at the notion of paying more taxes? Is America's weight problem creating a sort of cultural divide? We're going to get to all of those points, but we're going to stop with this. In the last week, we have seen our leaders once again threaten Iran. We have escalated the trade war with China for allegedly doing business with Iran. We have openly backed a coup in Venezuela. And right now, we are backing out of a nuclear treaty with Russia. Now, anyone would ask questions as they see these developments, right? They would wonder if it seems that the Cold War is somehow back on. But today's announcement of a pullout from the INF Treaty may be the most ominous sign of all, because what it does is it raises the specter of a possible new nuclear arms race. We are teaming up to bring you comprehensive coverage of this very important development. Sarah Montes de Oca will be starting us off. We'll explain the significance of the INF Treaty. Dan Cohen is going to be joining us, who's been following this story here in the United States and from the White House. And then from Moscow, we're going to have the very latest from Dan Hawkins, who's going to be giving us the Russian response. We begin, though, with Sarah to bring us up to date on both the history and the sense of the importance of this INF Treaty. Sarah, get us started.
Rick, today, Washington pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, also known as the INF, the treaty that was signed in 1987 by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader in the final years of the Cold War. The INF Treaty has been the cornerstone of international security for quite some time now. It required both the U.S. and Russia to seize the development and deployment of all intermediate-range nuclear-launched ballistic and cruise missiles. More specifically, the agreement prohibits the U.S. and Russia from possessing, producing, or test flying a ground-launched cruise missile with a range of 310 to 3,420 miles, much like the ones you see right here behind me. Now, concern in Western and Central Europe over the growing nuclear arsenals of the U.S. and USSR was one of the key reasons for the treaty, a concern that to this day is still strongly voiced by the EU. The INF Treaty was the first arms deal to ban an entire class of nuclear weapons.
This agreement contains the most stringent verification regime in history, including provisions for inspection teams actually residing in each other's territory and several other forms of on-site inspection as well. This treaty protects the interests of America's friends and allies. It also embodies another important principle, the need for glasnost, a greater openness in military programs and forces.
History has charged the governments of our countries and the two of us, Mr. President, with a solemn duty to justify the hopes of Americans and Soviet people and of people the world over, to undo the logic of the arms race by working together in good faith.
Since taking office in 2017, the Trump administration has pulled the U.S. out of several multilateral treaties and deals, including the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, NAFTA, TPP. But the INF is the most consequential diplomatic withdrawal to this day. Rick?
Thanks so much for that report, Sarah. Let's take you now to Dan Cohen. He's been gathering reaction all day long from our nation's capital, and he joins us now with the U.S. response. Dan, what you got?
Well, Rick, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has declared the United States will withdraw from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty as of February 2nd. He made the announcement at a State Department briefing Friday morning, some 60 days after President Trump announced his intentions to withdraw from the treaty.
We provided Russia an ample window of time to mend its ways and for Russia to honor its commitment. Tomorrow that time runs out. Russia has refused to take any steps to return real and verifiable compliance over these 60 days. The United States will therefore suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty effective February 2nd.
Pompeo presented no evidence that Russia is violating the INF Treaty. Nonetheless, this move, which by all accounts raises the likelihood of nuclear conflict, has the full support of America's NATO allies.
All NATO allies support the U.S. decision today to start the withdrawal process, but it will take 6 months before that process is completed, and we continue therefore to call on Russia to come back into compliance and fully respect the INF Treaty.
Now, inside the U.S., there's been mixed reactions. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi said the Trump administration is risking an arms race and undermining international security and stability. She accused the Trump administration of discarding a key pillar of America's non-proliferation security framework and creating unacceptable risks. She called on the Trump administration to exhaust every diplomatic effort to avoid thrusting the United States into a dangerous arms competition. California Representative Ted Lieu echoed that sentiment, saying the withdrawal encourages an arms race. He proposed a bill that requires congressional approval before the president can order the launching of a nuclear strike. Now, Democrats from the House Armed Services Committee put out a statement on Twitter saying the withdrawal plays into Russian President Vladimir Putin's hands. Neoconservative Senator Tom Cotton said the withdrawal is a good first start. He said it must be backed by American firepower and called for expediting the development and deployment of a new generation of ground-launched missiles. So the reactions continue to roll out, but again, we haven't seen any evidence of Russia's non-compliance and minimal talk about the terrifying possibility of nuclear conflict. Back to you, Rick.
And as you would expect from us, thank you so much, Dan. Here at RT America, we want to make sure we're as comprehensive as we can possibly be. That's why we had Sarah bringing you the latest on the story. We have reaction from Dan Cohen outside the White House. And now we're going to take you to Moscow, where Dan Hawkins is going to fill us in on what the response has been from Russia. Dan?
It does seem official as of today. The world has become that little bit more dangerous. The United States pulling out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, citing violations by Moscow of that key treaty. Russia, of course, has repeatedly denied over the past several years these U.S. accusations of violating the terms of that treaty, of developing weapons and missiles that go over the range specified in that agreement. Indeed, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov has gone so far as to say that the evidence presented by Washington of these violations by Russia was fabricated. Indeed, late in December last year, Russia held a public event to increase transparency surrounding this controversy, displaying the weaponry that has caused these disagreements. It's alleged that the United States representatives were invited to take part, to see this event, but chose not to attend. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that the U.S. withdrawal from this treaty holds wider ramifications for global security and global nuclear non-proliferation than simply U.S.-Russia relations.
After the US leaves the INF Treaty, the whole system of arms control and the stability of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty will be under threat.
Now, the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova went one step further. She stated that Russia reserved the right to take retaliatory measures and make a response to this US decision. She accused Washington of seeking to pull out of not only this agreement, but numerous international treaties and conventions.
Dan Hawkins reporting to us from Moscow. We appreciate it. Also, last week, I shared with you on this newscast a startling statistic. Do you remember when I said this? This report indicated that in the last year, the wealth of the top billionaires across the globe, across the whole world, rose by $2.5 billion per day. Per day. While the wealth of about 50% of the people on the planet, 3.8 billion people, reduced daily by about 500 million a day. Think about that. Take those numbers in. This is not a conversation, by the way, that you would normally hear at a place like the Davos World Economic Summit, where the richest, most powerful people on the planet gather every single year. But something happened. Something happened there this year during one of the panels. And it's a kind of it's a sign of the times that we live in. It happened when a moderator asked billionaire Michael Dell, the guy from Dell Computers, if he and others like him should pay more taxes, maybe even as high as 70%. Listen first to how he responds.
Michael Dell, do you support this?
I just want to say I'm thrilled that they're asking.
Wow. What a great question. Well, look, I mean, you know, my wife and I set up a foundation about 20 years ago, and we would have contributed quite a bit more than a 70% tax rate on my income, on my annual income.
So his argument is that we should simply trust anyone who is wealthy to take it upon themselves to decide what working people should or should not have, and that they will accomplish that with whatever number they feel is appropriate when they donate to charities. That's his argument. Then Dell, Mr. Dell, takes it even further when he makes his assertion, which he follows with a question. Listen to this.
And I don't think it would help the growth of the U.S. economy.
Oh, that's interesting. And can you say a little bit more about why? Why you don't think it would?
Well, name a country where that's worked, ever.
United States.
Briefly in the 80s.
Briefly in the 80s, she says. She's wrong. Dead wrong. And by the way, that woman is an economy writer for the Washington Post. And she doesn't even know the tax history of the United States. And obviously neither does, you know, Michael Dell. But there's one person who happens to be sitting on that panel right then and there, and he says, no, you're both wrong. Here, take a listen to him.
From about the 1930s through about the 1960s, the tax rate averaged about 70%. At times it was up as high as 95%. And those were actually pretty good years for growth.
Yeah, they were pretty good years for growth. They sure were. In fact, here's something interesting, maybe a perspective you haven't taken in. You know those MAGA hats that all the Trump supporters always wear? When they say, "Make America Great Again," you know what they're really referring to? They're talking about a time when Americans worked one job, not two, not three, when they had pension plans, when they were able to buy homes, and every year their homes would increase in value so they'd have a nest egg, and when they were able to retire from their jobs, things that no longer exist. That is the America that most people yearn for. But obviously Davos is not a place for regular Americans. It's a meeting place for billionaires and trillionaires who, as you just heard, actually laughed. Did you hear that? They laughed at the notion that rich people should pay more taxes. But then something else happens. And I want you to see this. I think this is very curious. One lone voice of dissent suddenly stands up. He looks at all these billionaires and all these trillionaires in the eye, and he says to them, this.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. Almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. I mean, it feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? Come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bull, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Wow. You know, when it comes to the question of who should pay more to provide for our society, for schools, to fix our roads, to build our bridges, to pay for our military, our health care, etc., it seems the answer you get really depends in large measure on the age of the person that you ask. It seems, interestingly enough, the older you are, the more apt you are to agree that the wealthy are the ones who should pay more. While young people, millennials, as we often call them, they seem to have a different point of view about this. NRS correspondent Michelle Greenstein took it upon herself to look into this phenomenon, and she's joining us with a deep dive, and we first have to ask her, why is it that millennials actually see this so differently?
That's a great question. Why do millennials tend to favor increased taxes on the rich? Well, first of all, Rick, millennials is anyone born from 80 to 95, so this is a huge group with diverse preferences and experiences, but I digress. Why do millennials want to tax the rich? The short answer is because the economy is not working for them. In fact, half of millennials think the American dream is dead. 2/3 of working millennials have nothing saved for their retirement. So why do we believe the American dream is dead? Why aren't we saving? Well, prices are rising, but our purchasing power isn't. This line is our wages, but this line is wages adjusted for inflation, virtually stagnant. Still, millennials are eating out more, choosing to eat at restaurants and bars instead of shopping at supermarkets. Aha! Millennials are making bad decisions. This is the conventional wisdom, right? That millennials are selfish, lazy, entitled, or just addicted to instant gratification. But the truth is, this is a material issue. This is a problem of scarcity. The effects of living with scarce money actually correspond to losing about 13 points of IQ, the equivalent of losing a night's sleep. With so little housing, job, and financial security, an entire generation has basically been trained not to plan for the future. And in a few decades, we will see a society of older people that will need to rely on their children. So what's making millennials poor? Why can't they save money? Why are they resorting to borrowing? Most millennials come into the workforce carrying a much heavier debt burden than past generations. Now, this is brought to you in part by the rising costs of healthcare. In 2018, Americans spent close to $1.2 trillion on hospital care. That's 14.7% of median household income. By 2026, that number is projected to be close to 1/5. This is in part because hospitals who have monopolies in certain areas can charge whatever they want, and also because hospitals literally prevent insurers from sending patients to other, less expensive or higher quality hospitals. This high rate of millennial borrowing is also brought to you in part by the cost of going to college, which is skyrocketing, close to 8 times faster than wages are. We were simply given little choice. Get a degree and then you can get a job. So we spent all this time, effort, and money working towards this goal. We even went into debt to do so. And don't get me started on credit card debt, which banks have been pushing hard on consumers. It's no secret we have a business model that maximizes profits for shareholders and cheats people down the line of the supply chains. It's no secret that when companies get so big, as banks and insurance companies tend to do, they're able to go to the government and demand bailouts. And it's no secret that the medical industrial complex means a patient cured is a customer lost. These are things that millennials noticed. We're overworked, underpaid, we're the most debt-burdened generation to ever exist, and because of this, we are stressed. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to explaining why younger people tend to be in favor of increased taxes for the rich. Many are quick to explain this phenomena away by saying things like, you get more conservative when you get older. No, you got more conservative as you got older. This system is not working for us. There is a clear societal shift happening, and millennials are just the ones existing as it happens. Rick, back to you.
When we started talking about this segment here on our in our editorial meetings, our producers, our writers, Michelle and myself, I immediately thought of Richard Wolff. I thought, you know what, this is the kind of conversation that if we were sitting at a bar somewhere having a beer, that's the guy I would want to hear his opinion as well. So by golly, sans the beer, we bring you noted Professor Richard Wolff. What say you to what we just heard young Michelle say?
Good for Michelle. She had the courage as well as the insight to speak about a very urgent problem. You know, I'm from the baby boomer generation,
yeah, me too.
but I take my hat off. I take my hat off to these younger people. They're being given a very raw deal. And it's a complicated raw deal because our generation, their parents, led them to believe, led them to expect the so-called American dream. We wanted to give that to our children, which was a good thing on our part, but we did not face what it means for a society to outsource jobs all over the world as corporations sought places to get cheaper workers than the ones they would have to pay here. We didn't think through where that leads. We didn't think through what it means that college is rising much more quickly in its costs than people could possibly afford to pay, thereby burdening, for the first time in American history, an entire generation of young people with enormous debt coming out of college that affect their life situation and the choices they make, and on and on. I don't want to repeat the things she said, but we led people, young people, millennials, to expect a decent economic chance just as we were taking it away from them, as we allowed this system to become ever more unequal in the distribution of its rewards, ever more burdensome in the fact that the jobs are poorer, the wages go nowhere, the pensions and other benefits get cut back, the government doesn't come in and do it, make up for that. The government's cutting back too. It's too much. And that they would be critical of society, I'm amazed they don't go much further than that, even though I do note that the number of people calling themselves socialists getting elected is obviously going up and finding a big audience, and nobody should be surprised.
You know, it's interesting. I think people see there's a problem, know there's a problem, but they can't seem to be able to put their finger on it. Do you agree with the statement I made a little while ago about when people say make America great again, what they're really saying is what happened to those conditions that we once lived under, and how can we get them back? Not to mention the irony that they put a guy in the White House who's not exactly known for being a taxpayer, right? We're kind of clueless right now as Americans, aren't we?
Well, I would go a little further. I think you're right, but I would go a little further. I think it's a big ask of the American people, after decades in which it was taboo to question capitalism. It was tantamount to being disloyal or crazy or some combination. So now you're saying, okay, it's now possible to criticize, but to take the next step, to begin to look at the scary question, how do you make change happen, that's going to take another little while to be free enough to raise those kinds of questions. I think it's a big advance that we're now finally having a debate over our economic system. That's the first step to getting beyond it.
Yeah, and we're continuing to do it, at least on this particular newscast, where we think these questions need to be asked. Richard Wolff, always a delight to have you on. Thank you, Professor.
My pleasure, and my kudos to you for having these conversations.
Thank you, sir. That's very kind. It is a good day to ask important questions, right? And now we're going to show you a video that makes us ask questions about whether there's a bit of a cultural war going on in the United States between the little people and the big people. Nope, this time I'm not talking about the economy, although there might have a little bit of an economic bent to this story as well. But let's put that aside. This conversation that we're about to have right now is about our country's weight problem, as in weight, right? It's about people everywhere we turn in America. We seem to see people just about everywhere, 250 pounds, 300 pounds, 400 pounds. Have you been to Disney World recently? People who are bigger than just about anybody in our recorded history. Well, this particular story that we use as a bounce point is about a woman who ended up sitting on an airplane between two very big people.
A woman was kicked off a United Airlines flight after going on a fat-shaming tirade about the people sitting next to her, calling them two pigs. The video seen all over social media.
Oh my goodness, I don't know how I'm going to do this for the next 4 hours. It's just impossible because they're squishing me.
The video shows this blonde woman sitting in the middle seat loudly complaining of the passengers sitting next to her, that they are overweight and that she can't take it.
I can't sit here because they're both so big. I'm left and right. I can't even sit here.
The incident happened on a flight from Las Vegas to Newark on New Year's Day.
I will not be verbally abused by anybody.
Norma Rogers, a registered nurse who was one of the passengers sitting next to the woman, recorded the encounter on her cell phone and later posted it to her Facebook page. The video was viewed more than 2 million times. She said she was verbally abusive. What made her think it was okay to body shame two people? I wanted to smack her. Other passengers outraged as well. One even told the fat shamer that she should be ashamed of herself.
I need salad.
You should be ashamed of yourself, man. What you're doing is so terrible. You should be ashamed of yourself.
Well, I'm not going to.
United removed the woman from the flight before takeoff, saying in a statement, United flight attendants acted quickly to find a different seat for the disruptive customer. When it became clear that this passenger's behavior was likely to be problematic on this flight, she was provided alternative travel arrangements first thing the next morning. According to reports, Rogers was happy with how the airline handled the situation, saying that the flight attendants were calm and professional and kept things from escalating. Reporting in New York, Trinity Chavez, RT.
Hey, thanks so much, Trinity. Okay, here's where we get to hear what you have to say. A lot of response. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people watched this lead story we started with yesterday between the Russian and the American jet. Nuts. Okay, let's start with Jan Dodell. She says, hey, Americans and Russians, don't nuke each other. My European homeland is right in the middle. How about you, go to the North Pole and then fight each other with swords? It's a great response. David Barnby says, the U.S., NATO infringing on what Russia considers to be its domain. Russia is not a threat to Europe or the Baltic states, but the U.S. cannot give up the Cold War. All right. And then Carl Williams says, people in the comments obviously don't realize the consequences. We thank you, as usual, for tuning in this week, for sharing your thoughts. We've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of you who've been tuning in, commenting, and engaging with us, and we certainly appreciate that. Keep writing, keep tuning in. We'll engage with you as well. And by the way, it's always important to say, just because we don't use your comment on the air doesn't mean we may not use it tomorrow. Keep writing. We'll keep reading. We'll keep responding. Thanks so much for being with us, and look for us again Monday, when it will be what time, by golly? It'll be time to do news again. I'm Rick Sanchez. Good night.